You will not believe what happened that night, because when I first heard the whispers about it, I thought people were exaggerating, spinning another one of those exaggerated legends that soldiers tell around campfires to frighten new recruits. But the truth was far darker and stranger than any rumor. And it all started with a single young woman who was dragged into the heart of a brutal military compound, surrounded by hardened fighters who thought they had broken countless prisoners before her. She had been captured during a raid on a border village, one of those violent sweeps where the soldiers did not care whether they pulled men or women, the young or the old, into their chain of command's merciless grasp, and everyone around believed she was just another nameless captive about to be humiliated into silence. The commander, a tall and battle-hardened man whose presence alone could silence a room, had ordered her stripped in front of the garrison, claiming it was to search for hidden weapons or coded marks. But in truth, it was meant to be a display of power, a ritual of fear that showed others what happened to those who dared defy them. The crowd gathered, boots thudding on the concrete floor of the barracks, rough laughter spilling from their mouths as they waited for the degrading spectacle, thinking they were about to enjoy another cruel display. The young woman, however, did not scream or beg the way many others had before her. Her eyes were fixed forward, unblinking, carrying a weight of calmness that unsettled a few who were observant enough to notice. When they tore at her worn-out clothes, expecting to see fear ripple through her body, what they did not realize was that they were about to uncover a truth that would send a shiver down the commander's spine and silence the entire room in a heartbeat. Because inked into her skin, running along the curve of her spine, was a mark that no ordinary villager would dare carry, a symbol that only the highest levels of power recognized, one that hinted at a secret identity buried deep beneath her simple exterior. That tattoo was not just a random design, not something done by chance. It was an emblem, a seal, and when the commander's eyes fell on it, his smirk faltered, his lips parted slightly, and his hardened hands trembled for the first time in years, because he knew exactly what it meant. He knew this woman was not who she appeared to be, and in that moment, as the crowd waited to see what would happen next, the commander realized the trap he might have walked into. For her presence, there threatened to unravel secrets the military had guarded with blood. And what's more chilling is that the woman seemed to know he recognized it, her faint smirk flickering across her face like a shadow, a smirk that told him she was not afraid, a smirk that told everyone present that the night was about to take a turn none of them expected, because once the truth behind the tattoo was revealed, nothing in their world would ever remain the same. The silence that followed inside that crowded room was so sharp, it felt like even the flickering lamps above had stopped humming, as though the entire world held its breath the moment the commander's eyes locked onto the tattoo carved in precise ancient strokes along her spine. The soldiers who had been jeering a second earlier now exchanged puzzled looks, confused by the sudden change in their leader's expression. He was a man who had once stared down barrels of enemy rifles without flinching, a man who had stood knee-deep in blood and mud and never once betrayed weakness. Yet here he was, frozen, his eyes wide with something that looked dangerously close to fear. The younger recruits whispered among themselves, asking each other what could possibly make the commander hesitate like this, but none of them knew the history of that emblem. Only the seasoned veterans, the ones who had fought in shadowy operations across deserts and forests, leaned forward with furrowed brows, their eyes narrowing as recognition flickered in their memories. That mark was forbidden, not merely because of what it represented, but because of the weight of history behind it. It was the insignia of a bloodline erased from records, a legacy so powerful that entire battalions had once sworn oaths in its name before being hunted down by the very government they served. To see it here, glowing faintly under the torchlight, etched into the skin of a woman who looked too young to remember such things, was like watching a ghost step into the room, a ghost carrying unfinished vengeance. The commander's throat tightened as he remembered nights long ago, nights when whispers in the officers' quarters spoke of a secret child, an heir hidden away while cities burned and kings were dethroned. He had dismissed those stories as drunken ramblings, yet here she stood, living proof that some fires never die out completely, that embers of rebellion survive in the unlikeliest places. He felt the weight of every soldier's stare pressing into him, waiting for a command, a reaction, a word, but none came. His hand twitched near his sidearm, but he did not draw it, because deep down he knew that to harm her was to ignite something greater, something beyond his control. And she, standing in the center of that hostile circle with her bare back revealed, did not tremble. Instead, she let them drink in the sight of her mark, knowing it would divide them, knowing that fear would slither into their discipline. Then, she turned her head slightly, her gaze cutting directly into the commander's, and in that stare was not just defiance, but recognition. She knew who he was too, knew what he had done years ago, and the sudden tightening of his jaw confirmed it. The men could not hear the unspoken words passing between them, but the air vibrated with tension thick enough to snap. A single spark in that moment could have unleashed chaos. Yet she spoke first, her voice steady, clear, and hauntingly calm, telling him that the sins of the past were not forgotten, that the oath broken long ago was about to be remembered. The commander's skin prickled with sweat, because he realized then that stripping her was not his victory. It was her plan, her trap to show them all what blood truly flowed in her veins, and he had walked straight into it. The barracks felt suffocating now, as if the air itself had thickened, wrapping around the soldiers' throats and making it harder for them to breathe, because no one could tear their eyes away from the mark burned into the young woman's back and the way their commander had frozen before it. Whispers spread through the ranks like wildfire, hushed tones filled with both curiosity and unease, because although many of the recruits did not know the full story behind the emblem, they understood enough to realize it was dangerous. One of the older sergeants, a man with scars cutting across his jawline and memories etched deep in his gaze, took an involuntary step backward, shaking his head as if denying what he saw, because he remembered nights on distant battlefields, when banners carrying that same symbol struck terror into entire armies, banners that had not been seen in decades, banners that supposedly burned when their last bearer was executed. Yet here it was again, not on cloth fluttering in the wind, but on the skin of a girl who refused to bow. The commander's silence stretched on for too long, unsettling the crowd, and when he finally opened his mouth, his voice cracked in a way few had ever heard before. He demanded to know who she was, though he already feared the answer, and her. Lips curved into a faint smile that carried both pain and triumph, as if she had been waiting her whole life for this confrontation. She told him she was not just a villager dragged from the ashes of war, not just another nameless prisoner, but the last living blood of the dynasty he and his superiors had betrayed, the lineage whose trust they had broken when they slaughtered her family under the cover of loyalty and torchlight. The room erupted into chaos. Some soldiers gasped, others scoffed in disbelief, but no one laughed anymore, because the trembling in the commander's stance confirmed her words carried truth. And then she reminded him, in a voice that echoed off the stone walls like a prophecy, that he himself had been there that night, that his blade had drawn the first crimson line across her father's chest, that his command had sealed the massacre, and yet in the chaos, a child had been hidden away, shielded by shadows, saved by those loyal enough to risk their lives, and that child had grown into the woman standing defiantly before him now. Her words struck harder than any weapon because they tore away the armor he had built around himself for years, exposing his crimes to the men who had followed him blindly. For the first time, the soldiers began questioning not her identity, but his honor, glancing between their leader and the captive, trying to decide where the truth really stood. The commander's jaw clenched, his fists tightening, but his eyes betrayed him. They were no longer filled with authority, only with the haunting reflection of a past he had hoped would remain buried forever. And she, with nothing left to lose, pressed further, her voice rising with each word, claiming that the emblem on her spine was not just proof of blood, but a call to arms, a message that the old dynasty's cause was not dead, that its heirs still breathed, and that vengeance walked among them. The silence that followed was not the silence of obedience anymore, but of doubt, a silence that cracked the foundation of discipline that held the unit together. In that fragile pause, one could almost hear the shift in loyalty, the subtle breaking of chains inside men's hearts who had long served a master without knowing the stains he carried on his soul. The weight of her revelation settled over the room like an avalanche, suffocating every voice, every thought, until even the flickering lanterns seemed to cast darker, sharper shadows across the stone walls. The commander, once a towering figure of unquestioned authority, now stood like a man cornered by ghosts, his pride battling the tremor in his chest, his authority eroded by the truth bleeding from the woman's words. He tried to regain control, barking orders for the soldiers to seize her, but his command cracked with desperation rather than strength, and the hesitation in his men was undeniable. No one moved immediately. Their boots remained rooted, their eyes darting between him and her, because a seed of doubt had already been planted deep within their ranks, and doubt spreads like poison in a disciplined unit. The woman straightened her back, exposing the tattoo fully as though daring any of them to lay a hand on her, her spine glowing with defiance beneath the torchlight, her presence radiating a strength that felt larger than her frame. She told them that the mark was more than proof of heritage. It was a covenant, a pledge that those who had spilled her family's blood would never escape judgment, no matter how many years passed, no matter how high the walls they built around themselves. Her voice carried such gravity that it echoed in the soldiers' bones, stirring something they could not easily dismiss, something primal and buried deep, the instinct to follow truth rather than lies, to serve honor rather than fear. The commander's breathing grew shallow as he realized his control was fracturing, and when he reached for his pistol, several of his men shifted uneasily, their hands brushing their own weapons, not yet in rebellion, but no longer in blind obedience either. The woman did not flinch at his threat. Instead, she stepped forward, her eyes locked on his trembling hand, her voice sharper now, demanding that he admit his crimes in front of those who had trusted him all these years. She reminded him of the night fire consumed her home, of the cries of her siblings drowned by the clash of steel, of the betrayal that cut deeper than any blade when men sworn to protect turned into butchers at his command. Her words pierced his composure until the commander's face twisted in rage, shame, and something dangerously close to grief, because the ghosts of that massacre still haunted him no matter how he buried them under medals and victories. He raised the pistol, finger quivering on the trigger, but before he could fire, one of the older sergeants spoke out, his voice trembling yet firm, declaring that he too remembered the symbol, that he too had once sworn loyalty to the dynasty, before the betrayal turned allies into enemies. His admission cracked the dam, and suddenly voices rose from all sides, some crying out in recognition, some in confusion, but all with the same realization that the commander had been hiding a past drenched in treachery. The commander roared, demanding silence, but the sound was drowned beneath the rising tide of unrest, his authority crumbling like brittle stone under relentless waves. And then, with deliberate calm, the woman turned fully to face him, her eyes shining with fire, her voice steady as she declared that his reign of fear ended that night, that the blood of her family demanded his reckoning. The commander's pistol shook violently now, sweat dripping down his brow, his soldiers closing in not to restrain her but to restrain him, their loyalty shifting before his eyes. For the first time in decades, he felt powerless, a man stripped of everything by the very truth he had tried to bury. And in the hush that followed, with every eye fixed on him, the commander did something no one expected. His knees buckled, and the weapon slipped from his grasp, clattering onto the floor as silence engulfed the room once more. The woman's victory was not won by violence, but by the weight of truth, by the unbreakable will of someone who carried history carved into her skin. And as she stood there, half-clothed yet unbroken, the soldiers realized they had witnessed something larger than themselves, a shift in power, a reminder that the past never truly dies. It waits, it lingers, and when the moment is right, it returns with a vengeance that no commander, no army can suppress.